The wind screamed, a physical weight battering the door, until the latch finally clicked home, sealing the silence inside. My goggles were fogged, my breath coming in sharp white puffs that vanished into the sudden, startling warmth of the airlock. But it wasn't the temperature shift that made my pulse jump. It was Julianne. She was standing too close, stripping off her heavy parka, the smell of ozone and cold clinging to her hair. She looked at me, that specific, unreadable glance she saved for when she thought I was distracted, and the professional distance I'd fought to maintain evaporated. "Storm's upgrading," she said, her voice low. "We're stuck." Station 4 was designed for efficiency, not cohabitation. It was a metallic blister on the edge of the Alaskan tundra, a grid of prefab panels and humming servers where privacy was a theoretical concept. Every surface was cold steel or hard plastic, functional and unyielding, much like Dr. Julianne Thorne herself. Or so the rumors went. Before I arrived, I'd read every paper she'd published, memorized her datasets on glacial recession. She was a legend in the field, brilliant, exacting, and notoriously solitary. I was the junior researcher, the lucky grad student who had clawed her way onto this expedition to prove she could handle the ice. I was supposed to be focusing on ice core samples and atmospheric pressure readings. Instead, I was spending 18 hours a day trying to keep my breathing even whenever she walked into the room. The station was impossibly small. It felt like the walls were slowly inching inward, compressing the air between us until it was thick enough to taste. The galley kitchen was the worst. It was a narrow strip of space where two people couldn't pass without turning sideways, without a brush of shoulders or hips. We had developed a choreography of avoidance, a silent dance of "excuse me" and "sorry" and stepping back against the counters. Every morning was a test of willpower. I'd stand by the kettle, gripping my mug until my knuckles turned white, waiting for her to finish at the sink. When she eventually moved, turning to squeeze past me to get to the fridge, the air between us would charge, static and heavy. I would hold my breath, flattening myself against the cabinets. But there was no escaping the sudden, overwhelming awareness of her body, inches from mine. It was a torture I secretly craved. Even when we didn't touch, the air between us felt charged, a physical force that made my skin prickle. Julianne moved with a deliberate economy of motion. She never rushed, never fumbled. She made coffee with the precision of a chemist titrating a solution, her hands steady, her profile sharp against the gray light of the window. I watched her from the safety of my data console, pretending to calibrate sensors while I memorized the way a stray lock of dark hair fell over her forehead. She would push it back with a quick, impatient gesture, and that small movement felt more intimate than a conversation. The silence out here was absolute. A heavy, pressing weight that amplified everything. I could hear the scratch of her pen on the logbook, the soft clink of her ceramic mug, the steady rhythm of her breathing, contrasting with the chaotic hammering of my own heart. There was no internet, no connection to the world we'd left behind. Just the two of us, suspended in this white void. I would sit with my back to her, typing up reports that felt increasingly meaningless, while my entire body was tuned to her frequency. It felt like we were the last two people on Earth. The station forced us into a proximity that stripped away the professional veneer, layer by layer. I knew how she took her tea. I knew she hummed quietly when the data wasn't lining up. I knew she smelled like cedar soap and cold air, a scent that had somehow seeped into my dreams. We were reviewing the morning satellite feeds when the routine finally cracked. The silence was broken, not by the wind, but by a sharp, discordant alarm from the main environmental controls. The red light on the console began to pulse, a heartbeat of warning in the dim room. Julianne dropped her pen, her head snapping up, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that had nothing to do with the sensors. "The heating unit," she said, the calm in her voice at odds with the flashing light. "It's the intake valve." It wasn't a question, it was a directive that shattered the fragile equilibrium we'd been maintaining. The alarm finally cut out, leaving a ringing silence that felt louder than the siren. We were jammed together in front of the primary maintenance console, a narrow alcove designed for one technician, not two scientists running on adrenaline and caffeine. To access the manual override for the intake valve, Julianne had to lean across me, her left arm bracing against the metal bulkhead by my head, her right hand flying over the keyboard. It was a position born of necessity, a functional maneuvering of bodies in a tight space. But my nervous system didn't interpret it that way. My nervous system interpreted it as a threat, or a promise, or both. Every time she keyed in a command, her shoulder pressed against mine. It wasn't a casual bump. It was a sustained point of contact, a friction that sent heat spiraling through the layers of my thermal undershirt. I tried to focus on the scrolling lines of code, on the pressure differentials for the heating unit, but my focus was fracturing. The air in the alcove was stagnant and close, trapping us in a pocket of intimacy I hadn't asked for. I could smell her properly now, not just the cold air from the airlock, but the underlying scent of her that the station's scrubbed air usually hid. It was cedar, sharp and clean, mixed with the harsh chemical tang of the sterile lab soap we all used. It shouldn't have been intoxicating. It should have been mundane, but mixed with the heat radiating from her body, it made my head swim. "Pressure is stabilizing," I said, my voice sounding thin to my own ears. I reached for the dial to adjust the fan speed, my hand brushing hers on the console. I pulled back, like I'd been burned. Julianne didn't pull back. She didn't even look at me. "Don't drop the intake yet," she commanded, her eyes glued to the screen. "We need to flush the sensor array first, or we lose the last 12 hours of data. If we flush the array while the intake is clogged, we risk overheating the core," I countered, the professional disagreement rising automatically. "We can afford to lose 12 hours. We can't afford to lose the heat." She turned her head then, slowly, the blue light of the monitor casting half her face in shadow. The distance between us was negligible. I could see the fine grain of her skin, the slight dilation of her pupils, the way her jaw was set tight. "I don't lose data," she said, her voice dropping an octave, rough with a frustration that felt disproportionate to the technical issue. "Reroute the power. Keep the intake open." It was a direct order, but it was also a challenge. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the hum of the servers vibrating through the floorboards, through the soles of our boots, up into our bones. This wasn't about the sensor array. It was about control. It was about the stark reality that we were alone at the end of the world. And the hierarchy that usually kept things safe was dissolving under the pressure of proximity. I held her gaze, refusing to blink, refusing to look away and concede the point. And in that silence, I saw it. It was microscopic, a tiny fissure in the marble facade of Dr. Julianne Thorne. Her gaze flickered down to my mouth, just for a fraction of a second, before snapping back to my eyes. It was a hesitation, a softening, the dizzying certainty of a woman who knows she is standing too close and doesn't want to move. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, traitorous rhythm. I had rules for this. I had built a fortress of rules before I ever set foot on the plane to Alaska. Rule 1. Competence is the only currency that matters. Rule 2. Emotions are variables to be eliminated. Rule 3. Never, ever let them see you want it. I had spent 5 years in academia perfecting the art of being invisible, of being the efficient, reliable researcher who never caused drama, who never blurred the lines. I had built those walls, brick by careful brick, mortared with fear and ambition, designed to keep me safe from exactly this kind of complication. Falling for the lead researcher on a remote expedition wasn't just a cliché. It was professional suicide. It was a disaster waiting to happen. But looking at her now, seeing that crack in her armor, I felt the mortar turning to dust. "Fine," I whispered, the fight draining out of me, replaced by something warmer and more dangerous. Rerouting power. I turned back to the console, my hands shaking slightly as I keyed in the sequence. Julianne didn't move away. She stayed right there, her warmth bleeding into my side, her breathing syncing with mine in the quiet dark. We worked in tandem, a seamless unit of efficiency, saving the data and stabilizing the heat. But the air around us had changed. It was charged now, heavy with things we weren't saying. Then the floor shuddered. It wasn't the machinery this time. It was the building itself. A low, groaning vibration started in the walls, rising in pitch until it was a howl that drowned out the hum of the servers. I looked up at the small, reinforced window above the console. The gray twilight outside had vanished, swallowed by a wall of churning white. The wind hit the station with the force of a freight train, and the lights above us flickered, buzzed, and died. The darkness lasted less than 3 seconds. But in that void, the sound of the storm became a physical weight pressing against my eardrums, vibrating through the soles of my boots. Then, with a mechanical thunk that echoed through the chassis of the station, the emergency backups kicked in. The overhead fluorescents didn't return. Instead, the station was bathed in a deep, saturated crimson. The emergency lighting was designed to preserve night vision and reduce power draw, but the effect was immediate and visceral. It transformed our sterile, scientific outpost into something else entirely. A dark room, a submarine, a heartbeat. The white walls turned the color of dried blood, and the shadows in the corners lengthened, becoming absolute. "Status," Julianne said, but the command lacked its usual snap. She was looking at the ceiling, listening to the wind howling outside. "Main power is offline," I replied, checking the readout. My voice sounded strange in the red light, softer, less certain. "We're running on the battery banks. Life support is priority 1. Everything else is cut." The realization settled over me like the heavy thermal blanket I'd need later. The satellite link was dead. The radio would be static. There was no world outside of these 4 metal walls. No authority to report to, no protocols that could account for the way the red light carved hollows into Julianne's throat and cheekbones. The storm had erased the horizon. We moved through the station, checking seals and securing loose equipment, navigating the narrow corridors, not with the stiff avoidance of the morning, but with a fluid, necessary cooperation. We were just 2 bodies, trying to keep the heat in. By 1900 hours, the initial adrenaline had faded, replaced by a gnawing hunger. We retreated to the galley. In the crimson gloom, the simple act of heating up freeze-dried stew felt illicit, like we were conspiring. We sat across from each other at the small metal table, the steam from our bowls rising into the red air. The wind was still screaming outside, a constant, violent backdrop that made the silence inside feel heavy and intimate. "I used to love this part," Julianne said suddenly. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring into her coffee mug, her hands wrapped around it for warmth. The isolation, the feeling that the rest of the world had just stopped. "Used to?" I asked, risking the personal question. The red light gave me courage. It felt like we were hidden, like the rules of the daylight world didn't apply here. She looked up then, and the raw honesty in her expression caught me off guard. "It gets quieter every year," she admitted, her voice low. "You think you're building a legacy. You publish the papers, you get the grants, you become the person everyone cites. But then you go home to an empty apartment in Boston, and you realize you haven't spoken to a human being about anything other than ice sheets in 6 months." She laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "I have a ficus plant I talk to. That's the sum total of my personal life." I stopped eating. The spoon hovered halfway to my mouth. This was Dr. Thorne, the Iron Queen of glaciology, admitting that her life was a hollow shell. It was a vulnerability she never showed, a soft underbelly exposed by the storm and the red light. I wanted to reach across the table. The urge was so strong it actually made my hand twitch. I wanted to cover her hand with mine, to tell her she wasn't invisible, that I saw her, really saw her. But I sat on my hands. I retreated behind my own walls, terrified by how easily hers were coming down. If I comforted her now, in this red-lit intimacy, I would never be able to go back to being her employee. "It's the cost of the work," I said, the words tasting like ash. "It's what we signed up for." "Is it?" She held my gaze, and the air between us thickened, charged with that same electricity from the console earlier. "I'm starting to wonder if the price is too high." The domesticity of it was suffocating. The storm outside, the warmth inside, the two of us sharing a meal while the world ended. It felt like playing house in the apocalypse. I was drowning in it, in the proximity, in the way the red light caught the dampness of her lips. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, to break the tension, to pull us back to safe, professional ground. But the station made the decision for me. A sharp, mechanical clunk echoed from the rear of the station, followed by the distinct, dying whine of a fan spinning down. The ambient hum of the air circulation system stuttered and died. Julianne was on her feet instantly, the vulnerability vanishing behind a mask of command. That came from the sleeping quarters. I followed her down the short hall, my heart sinking. The temperature in the bunk room was already dropping. I could feel the cold radiating from the vents. The auxiliary heating unit, the one responsible for keeping our sleeping quarters habitable, had seized. We stood in the doorway, watching our breath begin to fog in the air, realizing simultaneously what this meant. There was only one room left in the station with a functioning heat source. The main lab became our lifeboat. We dragged the thermal sleeping bags from the freezing bunk room, laying them out on the rubberized floor between the server racks and the main console. It was a surreal reconfiguration of space. The place where we analyzed glacial receding rates was now the only place we wouldn't freeze to death. The red emergency lighting turned the room into a dark room, washing out the details and leaving only shapes and shadows. It felt less like a research station and more like the inside of a heart, pulsing with a low, desperate rhythm. The transformation wasn't just spatial, it was personal. To sleep, we had to shed the armor. I sat on my makeshift bed and watched Julianne peel off the heavy canvas utility vest, then the thick wool sweater she wore over her base layers. It was a striptease of necessity, devoid of performance, but heavy with implication. Beneath the bulk of her gear, she was wearing form-fitting thermal gray, a soft, breathable fabric that clung to the lines of her shoulders and the curve of her waist. I had spent weeks seeing her as a shapeless silhouette of Gore-Tex and down, a formidable machine of science. Seeing her now, in the soft, red-drenched light, stripped down to the essential layers, felt like seeing a secret. She looked smaller, more human, and dangerously touchable. We had just come back from checking the airlock seals, a mandatory hourly protocol to ensure the pressure wasn't dropping. My gloves had been off for maybe 2 minutes to manipulate a frozen latch, but the cold had bitten deep. I was sitting on my sleeping bag, rubbing my hands together, trying to coax the feeling back into my fingertips, when Julianne stopped pacing. "Let me see," she said. It wasn't a request. She knelt in front of me, her knees brushing mine. In the cramped space of the makeshift camp, the intimacy was unavoidable. But this was deliberate. She took my hands in hers. Her skin was impossibly warm, a shocking contrast to the ice that seemed to have settled in my marrow. She turned my hands over, inspecting the fingertips with professional detachment, checking for the waxy pallor of frostnip. "Capillary refill is slow," she murmured, pressing her thumb into the pad of my index finger. The color flooded back, pale, then pink. "You need to be more careful. The gloves stay on, Emma. Always." "The latch was stuck," I defended, but my voice was barely a whisper. She didn't let go. The medical assessment was finished. My hands were cold, not damaged, but she didn't pull away. Her thumbs began to trace the ridges of my knuckles, a slow, rhythmic caress that had nothing to do with circulation and everything to do with the way the air in the room had suddenly thickened. It was a mesmerizing, intoxicating sensation. The friction of her skin against mine sent a jolt straight to my chest, bypassing my brain entirely. I sat frozen, afraid that if I breathed, the moment would shatter. She was looking at my hands, but her focus was inward. I saw her throat work as she swallowed. The silence stretched, heavy and coiled, filled only by the hum of the servers and the distant muffled scream of the wind. "Do you ever wish you were somewhere else?" she asked, her voice low, still watching her thumbs move over my skin. "Right now. Do you wish you were back in a warm apartment miles away from this?" It was a loaded question. The safe answer was yes. The safe answer was to laugh about tropical beaches and central heating. But the heat of her hands was making me reckless. "No," I said, the truth slipping out before I could catch it. "I don't wish I was anywhere else." Her hands stilled on mine. She looked up, her dark eyes searching my face in the crimson light, looking for the lie. She wouldn't find one. "That's dangerous," she whispered. "Liking the storm." "I never said I liked the storm," I countered, holding her gaze. "I just said I didn't want to be anywhere else." The tension was a physical pressure, a taut wire pulled between us. She leaned in, just an inch, and for a second I hoped, she would bridge the gap. But then the backup generator cycled with a loud clunk, and the moment broke. She pulled her hands away, the loss of contact leaving my skin stinging with cold. "Get some sleep," she said abruptly, turning away to her own sleeping bag. "We have to fix the external sensor array as soon as this clears. We'll need the energy." I lay in the dark, listening to her breathing even out, knowing neither of us was sleeping. The storm raged all night, but by 0600, the wind died. The silence that followed was absolute. We woke to a world that was still and terrifyingly bright. The blizzard had passed, leaving a pristine, deadly landscape waiting for us. And the sensor needed fixing. Stepping out of the airlock was like walking onto the surface of a different planet. After the claustrophobic, womb-like crimson of the emergency lighting, the world outside was a violent, blinding white. The storm had scoured the landscape clean, erasing any familiar landmarks, leaving only an endless expanse of ice that reflected the sun with searing intensity. Even behind my polarized goggles, I had to squint against the glare. The cold hit me instantly, seeking out the microscopic gaps in my gear, a physical weight that pressed against my chest and made every breath a conscious effort. It was 40 degrees below zero, the kind of cold that turns moisture to ice in the lungs, the kind of cold that doesn't just freeze you, it erases you. Julianne was already 10 meters ahead, a dark silhouette against the blinding horizon. She moved through the deep drifts with a breathtaking competence, her stride long and sure, breaking the trail for me to follow. Inside the station, she was a scientist, a woman of data and controlled variables. Out here, she was something else entirely. She was elemental. I watched the way she leaned into the wind, the way she navigated the treacherous terrain without hesitation, and I felt a surge of admiration that was dangerously close to worship. It wasn't just that she was good at her job, it was that she belonged here, in this hostile, beautiful emptiness, in a way I never would. We reached the sensor array, a skeletal metal tower encrusted in rime ice. The work was brutal. We had to chip away the ice to access the panel, our movements clumsy in the thick gloves. My fingers were numb within minutes, despite the hand warmers, but Julianne worked with a relentless focus. She didn't complain, didn't slow down. She passed me tools before I even asked for them, our rhythm from the console translating perfectly to the freezing tundra. When the green light finally blinked on the panel, signaling the array was online, she turned to me and gave a thumbs up. Even through the bulky suit and the reflective visor, the gesture felt personal, a shared victory in a war against the elements. The trek back should have been easier. The path was broken, the station was in sight, a tiny gray box in the distance that promised heat and safety. But fatigue makes you stupid. It makes you careless. I was watching Julianne's back, mesmerized by the sway of her gait, thinking about the heat of her hands on mine the night before, instead of watching where I put my feet. I stepped on a patch of blue ice, hidden beneath a dusting of powder snow. The world tilted. It happened in slow motion, the loss of friction, the sudden weightlessness, the horizon swinging wildly to the side. I flailed, trying to find purchase, but there was nothing but slick, unforgiving ice. I was going down, and on this terrain, a fall could mean a cracked visor, a twisted knee, a death sentence. Then, an impact. I didn't hit the ground. I hit Julianne. She had spun around with supernatural speed, sensing the disruption in the rhythm of our march. She caught me, her arm hooking around my waist, her other hand grabbing the front of my parka. The momentum slammed us together, chest to chest, the hard plastic of our gear colliding with a jarring thud. The breath left my lungs in a rush. I was dangling, my feet skidding for purchase, held up entirely by her strength. She didn't buckle. She was an anchor, immovable and solid in a world that was trying to slide away. "I've got you," she said. Her voice came through the comms in my ear, distorted by static but unmistakably rough. "I've got you, Emma. Stand up." I found my footing, the crampons biting into the ice. But she didn't let go. Her arm was still a steel band around my waist, pulling me flush against her. Through the layers of down and Gore-Tex, through the thermal undershirts and the armor we both wore against the world, I could feel the impact of her. I could feel the heave of her chest as she breathed, the tension in her muscles. We were alone. Miles of empty ice stretched out in every direction, a white void that swallowed everything. There were no witnesses, no protocols, no station logs to record this. Just the wind and the blinding sun and the way she was holding me. She should have released me. I was steady. I was safe. But her grip tightened. She leaned back slightly, looking down at me through her visor. I couldn't see her eyes, only my own reflection in the gold-tinted glass. But I could feel her gaze. It was heavy, physical, searing through the layers of gear to the skin beneath. This wasn't a rescue anymore. It was a claim. "Are you hurt?" she asked. But the question felt irrelevant. "No," I breathed, the word fogging the inside of my helmet. I'm okay. Good. The word was a growl. Because I'm not leaving you out here. She held me for 3 more seconds. An eternity in the cold. A lifetime in the silence of the tundra. In those 3 seconds, the resistance I had constructed around my heart didn't just crack. It shattered. I realized, with a stark clarity, that I didn't care about the cold. I didn't care about the expedition. I would have let the ice take me if it meant she would hold me like this, desperate and possessive, for just a moment longer. She released me slowly, her gloved hand lingering on my arm as she stepped back, creating a distance that felt suddenly, painfully vast. "Walk in front of me," she ordered, her voice back to its professional cadence, though I could hear the tremor she couldn't hide. "I need to see where you are." I turned and started walking toward the station, my legs shaking not from the cold, but from the aftershocks of her touch. I walked, but part of me stayed back there on the ice, held fast in her arms. The hiss of the airlock repressurizing was the only sound in the world, a sharp intake of breath that signaled we were back among the living. As the heavy steel door sealed us in, the sudden silence of the interior felt deafening after the howling expanse outside. The red emergency lights were gone, replaced by the harsh, clinical glare of the standard fluorescence that had flickered back to life with the main generator. It should have felt normal. It should have felt safe. But standing there in the cramped decontamination chamber, dripping melting snow onto the metal grate, I felt flayed open. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, though the chill was still radiating off my outer shell, but from the adrenaline crash. My body was still registering the phantom sensation of her arm around my waist, the solid, unyielding pressure of her chest against mine. I fumbled with the clasps of my heavy parka, my fingers clumsy and thick in the liners. The Velcro tore with a loud, ripping sound that made me flinch. Julianne was already halfway out of her gear. She moved with that same brutal efficiency, stripping away the layers of armor until she was back to the thermal gray undershirt and the practical cargo pants. Her hair was matted against her forehead with sweat. Her cheeks flushed a high, frantic color that looked like fever. She didn't look at me. She was focused on hanging her gear on the drying rack, her movements sharp and jerky. "Get those layers off," she said, her voice tight. She didn't turn around. "You can't regulate your temperature in wet down." I tugged at the main zipper of my parka. It was frozen. A common enough occurrence, ice crystals welding the teeth together. Usually I would just wait, let the ambient heat do the work. But the air in the lock was stifling, thick with the smell of wet wool and ozone and the sharp metallic tang of our own exertion. I needed to get out of this suit. I needed to breathe. I yanked harder, frustration bubbling up in my throat, mixing with the panic I was trying to suppress. The zipper didn't budge. "Damn it," I hissed, the sound small and pathetic in the small room. Julianne turned. She saw my struggle, saw the way my hands were trembling as I fought the mechanism. She didn't say a word. She just crossed the distance between us in 2 strides. "Stop," she said quietly. "You'll break the track." She batted my hands away, not gently. Her fingers were bare now, long and nimble, and when they brushed against my neck to grasp the collar of the parka, the contact burned. She stepped into my personal space, filling my vision. I was trapped between the metal lockers and the heat of her body. I stopped breathing. I had to. If I breathed, I would inhale her, the scent of her sweat, the ozone, the reality of her presence overwhelming my senses. She worked the zipper with focused intensity, her head bent. I was staring at the top of her head, at the part in her dark hair. She was so close that I could count the individual lashes on her lowered eyelids. She was so close that I could feel the warmth of her breath ghosting against the sensitive skin of my throat, just above the thermal collar. "It's just ice," she murmured, more to herself than to me. Her knuckles grazed my collarbone as she worked the slider down. Just ice. The zipper gave way with a sudden rasp. She pulled it down slowly, revealing the heaving rise and fall of my chest beneath the thermal layers. She didn't step back. She kept her hand on the zipper pull, resting right at the center of my chest, right over my heart. She had to feel it. She had to feel the way it was hammering against my ribs, a desperate, frantic rhythm that had nothing to do with the cold. She looked up. Her eyes were dark, the pupils blown wide despite the bright lights. We were standing in the wreckage of our professional distance, the debris of protocols and rules scattered around our feet like the melting snow. "You're shaking," she said. It wasn't an observation. It was an accusation. "I'm fine," I lied. The words were breathless, weak. "Just the temperature change." "Liar." The word hung there, heavy and undeniable. She didn't move her hand. Her fingers flexed slightly against my chest, a subconscious claim. The airlock felt like it was shrinking, the walls pressing in, forcing us closer until there was no air left to breathe, only the shared oxygen of our mutual panic. "We have 3 days," I blurted out. The thought had been clawing at the back of my mind since the ice. "The extraction team, they're coming in 3 days." The effect was instantaneous. Julianne flinched as if I'd slapped her. Her hand dropped from my chest and she took a sharp step back, the sudden distance hitting me like a physical blow. The vulnerability in her eyes vanished, slammed shut behind a steel door of composure. She turned away, grabbing a towel from the rack and scrubbing it over her face, hiding her expression from me. "I know the schedule, Emma," she said, her voice flat, stripped of all the heat and intimacy of the moment before. "I wrote the schedule. I just meant—" I trailed off, not sure what I meant. I just knew that the clock was ticking, that this bubble we were living in was about to pop, and the panic of losing this, whatever this was sharper than the fear of the storm. "3 days is a long time," she said into the towel. When she lowered it, her face was composed, her jaw set in a hard line. "Get dried off. We have data to log." She walked out of the airlock without looking back, the heavy door clicking shut behind her. I stood there in the dripping silence, my parka hanging open, my heart still racing, realizing that the cold outside was nothing compared to the chill of her leaving the room. The extraction wasn't a rescue anymore. It was a deadline. And I was terrified we weren't going to make it. The next 48 hours were a blur of frantic activity and suffocating silence. We worked like machines, processing the backlog of data from the storm, calibrating the sensors, preparing the station for shutdown. We were the perfect team, efficient, synchronized, brilliant. We spoke in shorthand, anticipating each other's needs before they were voiced. "Pass the logbook, check the pressure valve. Coffee's ready." But underneath the surface, the tension was building, a pressurized gas filling the station, waiting for a spark. We avoided the galley. We avoided the narrow corridors. We retreated to separate corners whenever the work allowed, terrified of accidental contact. Every time our eyes met, the air would crackle, and we would both look away, guilty and desperate. It was exhausting. It was unsustainable. Then came the final night. The extraction helicopter was scheduled for 0800 hours. The bags were packed, stacked neatly by the airlock. The hard drives were encrypted and secured. The station was ready to be abandoned to the ice. We were sitting in the main lab, the heart of the station, surrounded by the hum of the servers that would keep running long after we were gone. I was typing the final executive summary, the keys clacking loudly in the quiet room. Julianne wasn't working. She was standing by the observation window, staring out at the darkness. She held a glass of amber liquid in her hand, whiskey from a bottle I didn't know she had. Alcohol was strictly prohibited on active duty. Seeing her with it was shocking, a flagrant violation of the rules she held so dear. It was a signal that the rules no longer applied. She took a sip, grimaced, and then turned to face the room. She started pacing. It was a restless, caged animal movement, back and forth in front of the server racks. Her boots struck the floor with a heavy, rhythmic cadence. Thud, thud, turn, thud, thud. I tried to focus on the screen. Atmospheric pressure stabilized at thud, thud. Core samples indicate a variance of thud, thud. Will you sit down? I snapped, the words escaping before I could check them. I can't focus. She stopped mid-stride. She looked at me, her eyes bright and dangerous. Is that what you're doing? Focusing? I'm trying to finish the report, I said, my voice rising. One of us has to. The report, she repeated, the word dripping with disdain. She set the glass down on a console with a sharp clink. The report is done, Emma. The data is safe. The mission is a success. We can go home and get our awards and pretend none of this happened. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? She started walking toward me, not pacing this time, advancing. She moved with a predatory grace, closing the distance between the window and my desk. My heart hammered a warning against my ribs. Retreat! Danger! Run! But I couldn't move. I was frozen in my chair, watching her come closer, watching the way the overhead light caught the sharp angle of her cheekbone, the pulse beating in her throat. She stopped directly behind my chair. I could feel her heat radiating against my back. I could smell the whiskey on her breath, mixing with the cedar and the ozone. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My hands hovered over the keyboard, paralyzed. Stop typing, she commanded. Her voice was low, rough, vibrating through the back of the chair, through my spine. It wasn't a request. It was an order from the lead researcher. But the tone was entirely personal. I didn't move. I stared at the blinking cursor on the screen, waiting. Emma, she said, and my name sounded like a curse and a prayer in her mouth. She reached out, her hands gripping the back of my chair, leaning down until her lips were inches from my ear. Stop typing. I took my hands off the keyboard. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the weight of everything we hadn't said for 6 weeks. Turn around, she whispered, slowly, terrifyingly. I spun the chair. The movement brought us knee to knee, a collision of denim and heavy canvas that sent a jolt straight up my spine. The space between us had evaporated, replaced by a charged, magnetic field that made the hair on my arms stand up. Julianne didn't back away. She stayed right there, looming over me, her hands still gripping the back of my chair, trapping me in the circle of her dominance. In the harsh glare of the lab lights, there was nowhere to hide. I could see the fine tremor in her hands, the way her pupils were blown wide, swallowing the iris. The professional mask she wore like armor had completely disintegrated, leaving something raw and terrifyingly open in its wake. You think I've been analyzing the ice core data, she said, her voice rough, barely more than a whisper. You think I've been staring at those screens for 6 weeks because I'm obsessed with the thermal gradients? Aren't you? I managed to choke out. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure she could see it beating against my ribs. No. She let go of the chair and stepped in, her thighs brushing against my knees. She reached out, her fingers hovering for a second before she traced the line of my jaw, a touch so light it felt like a burn. I haven't been looking at the data, Emma. I've been looking at you. The air left the room. My carefully constructed reality, the one where I was the invisible junior researcher and she was the untouchable icon, shattered into a million pieces. I've been watching you trying to make yourself small, she continued, her thumb brushing over my pulse point, sensing the frantic rhythm there. I've been watching you bite your lip when you're concentrating. I've been watching you memorize the layout of this station so you never have to accidentally touch me. And every time you pull away, It makes me want to pull you closer. Julianne, I breathed, her name feeling illicit on my tongue. We can't. The protocols. To hell with the protocols. She leaned down, bracing her hands on the armrests of my chair, caging me in completely. Her face was inches from mine, close enough that I could smell the oaky warmth of the whiskey and the sharp, clean scent of cedar that was just her. The expedition is over, Emma. The helicopter comes in 10 hours. We go back to the real world, and you go back to being my employee, and I go back to being a line on your CV. She paused, her gaze dropping to my mouth, then dragging back up to my eyes with a searing intensity. I can't do that, she confessed, the words tearing out of her. I can't go back to pretending this isn't real. I need to know what it feels like to kiss you before this expedition ends. The confession hung in the silence, heavy and absolute. It was the moment my walls fell. Not a slow erosion, but a catastrophic structural failure. The fear of losing my job, the fear of the power dynamic, the fear of rejection, it all vanished under the weight of her want. She wasn't asking for a transaction. She was asking for permission. I didn't speak. I couldn't. Instead, I reached up and tangled my fingers into the hair at the nape of her neck, pulling her down. The kiss wasn't tentative. It was a collision. Julianne made a low sound in her throat, a growl of relief and hunger, and crushed her mouth against mine. It was hot and desperate, tasting of whiskey and weeks of suppressed longing. Her hands left the armrests to cup my face, holding me like I was something precious and fragile that she wanted to devour. I kissed her back with everything I had. I opened to her, letting her in, letting the heat of her tongue sweep away the last of my defenses. It was sultry and consuming, a physical conversation where we poured every stolen glance and unspoken desire into the friction of our lips. She pulled me up out of the chair, dragging me into her body until there was no space left between us, until I could feel the hard lines of her hips against mine and the desperate beat of her heart echoing my own. This wasn't just a kiss, it was a claiming. It was Julianne Thorne, the woman who controlled everything, finally losing control. Her grip on my waist was bruising, grounding, anchoring me to the earth while the room spun around us. I realized, with a clarity that was almost blinding, that I had been waiting for this since the moment I stepped off the plane. I had been waiting for her to break the rules. When we finally broke apart, gasping for air, our foreheads rested against each other. Her eyes were closed, her lashes dark against her flushed skin. "Okay," she whispered, her voice wrecked. "Okay, okay," I echoed, knowing that nothing would ever be okay, or the same, again. We didn't let go. That was the most shocking part of the immediate aftermath. Not the kiss itself, though that had rearranged my entire understanding of gravity, but the fact that when it ended, neither of us retreated. Usually, after a breach of protocol, there is a snapback, a frantic reclaiming of distance. But Julianne didn't step back. She stayed right there, her forehead resting against mine, her hands still framing my face, her thumbs tracing the shell of my ear with a reverence that made my knees weak. The silence that rushed back into the room wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the last 6 weeks. It was the quiet of a pressure vessel that had finally been vented. "I didn't think you would," I whispered, the words vibrating in the small space between our mouths. "I thought I was making it all up. I thought I was projecting." "You weren't projecting," she murmured, her voice low and rough, stripped of its usual command. I was projecting. I was projecting lead researcher so hard I thought I might crack a rib. She pulled back just enough to look me in the eye, and the raw honesty in her gaze was more disarming than the storm outside had ever been. "I wanted to do this the first time I saw you in the galley, trying to make coffee while the ship rolled. You looked so determined not to spill it. I found it distracting. Distracting, I repeated, a laugh bubbling up in my chest, light and giddy. I was terrified of you. I know. Her thumb brushed my lower lip, a slow, deliberate movement that made my breath hitch. That's why I stayed away. I didn't want to scare you, and I didn't want to jeopardize the grant. But then the storm hit, and the lights went out, and she shook her head as if she still couldn't believe it herself. I realized I didn't care about the grant. I cared about where your hands were. She kissed me again, slower this time. Not a collision, but an exploration. It was a sultry, languid claiming, her mouth moving over mine with a dizzying expertise. It tasted of the whiskey she'd been nursing and the mint tea I'd had an hour ago, a collision of flavors that shouldn't have worked, but felt like the only thing that made sense. Her hands slid down from my face to my shoulders, then down my arms, grounding me, mapping the tension that was slowly leaving my body. We moved, by unspoken agreement, away from the harsh glare of the monitors and the accusatory blinking of the cursor. We ended up on the small, battered love seat in the corner of the lab, the one usually reserved for power naps during long data runs. We didn't sit. We collapsed into it, a tangle of limbs and heavy breathing. I sat sideways, my legs thrown over hers, and she pulled me into her chest, wrapping her arms around me like she was trying to shield me from the station itself. It wasn't just physical. It was a conversation we'd been having in code for 40 days, finally spoken aloud. Every touch was a question answered. Yes, I want this. Yes, it's real. Yes, I'm terrified too. The helicopter, I said, against the fabric of her thermal shirt, the reality of the timeline intruding on the haze. Julianne, they're coming in 8 hours. 7.5, she corrected automatically, the scientist in her unable to help it. But then she tightened her grip, her hand pressing flat between my shoulder blades. Let them come. We have 7.5 hours. That's a lifetime in station time. And then what? I asked, pulling back to search her face. The lab was dim now, the only light coming from the server racks casting long, dancing shadows across her features. We land in Anchorage and shake hands? Good expedition, Dr. Thorne. Her expression hardened. Not at me, but at the idea. No, she said firmly. Absolutely not. I am not shaking your hand, Emma. I am done shaking your hand. But the review board can find someone else to lead the next survey, she interrupted. Or they can deal with it. I don't care. I spent 10 years building a reputation that terrified everyone, including myself. It kept me warm, sure, but it didn't feel like this. She ran her hand down my arm, interlacing her fingers with mine. Her palm was calloused, warm, and real. I'm not rebuilding the walls, Emma. I can't. You took a sledgehammer to them. I think the storm helped, I offered. The storm just gave me an excuse, she countered. You were the catalyst. We stayed there as the hours bled away, suspended in the twilight of the station. We didn't sleep. Sleep felt like a waste of the limited time we had left in this private world we'd built. Instead, we talked, whispered, really, about everything we'd held back. She told me about the pressure of the last grant cycle, how she'd felt like a fraud even as she accepted the awards. I told her about the moment on the ice, how I'd almost let myself fall, just to see if she'd catch me. I will always catch you, she said, and the ferocity in her voice made my chest ache. Always. At some point, the whiskey bottle was moved to the floor. Unsealed, but forgotten. We didn't need it. The intoxication was already in the air, in the smell of cedar and skin, in the way her breathing synced with mine. I rested my head on her shoulder, listening to the steady thump of her heart, feeling the rise and fall of her chest. It was the most domestic, intimate moment of my life, happening in a high-tech tin can at the bottom of the world. I need to ask you something, she said after a long silence, her voice vibrating against my ear. What? The data log from Tuesday. The glacial shift variance. I laughed, burying my face in her neck. You are impossible. We are having a romantic crisis, and you're thinking about the variance? I'm multitasking, she said, but I could hear the smile in her voice. She kissed the top of my head, holding me tighter. I need to know you're real, that this isn't just hypoxia or station fever. I lifted my head, kissing the pulse point at her throat, feeling it jump under my lips. I'm real, I promised. I'm right here. Good, she whispered. Stay here. And I did. I stayed right there, wrapped in her arms, as the station hummed around us and the clock on the wall ticked relentlessly toward the dawn. I watched the numbers change, dreading the sun, dreading the sound of rotors, dreading the inevitable return of the world that would try to tear us apart. But for now, in the red-tinged shadows of Station 4, she was mine, and I knew, with the certainty of a data point, that I wasn't going to let her go. The morning didn't break. It shattered. The silence we had lived in for weeks was torn apart by the rhythmic, thumping heartbeat of the extraction helicopter. It wasn't a rescue sound anymore. It sounded like an invasion. I woke up with a start, my neck stiff from the angle of the love seat, Julianne's weight heavy and warm against my side. For a second, just a split second, I forgot where we were. I just felt her hair against my cheek and the steady rise of her chest. Then the radio crackled to life on the console, static, then a voice asking for landing coordinates. And the world came rushing back in. Julianne didn't jump. She woke up slowly, her eyes opening to find mine immediately. There was no regret in them, no morning after panic that we'd made a mistake, just a fierce, quiet protectiveness. She reached out, silenced the radio with one hand, and pulled me back down for a kiss that tasted like sleep and defiance. Ignore them, she whispered against my mouth. Give me one more minute. We stole that minute. We hoarded it like oxygen. But the rotors were getting louder. The transition from the intimate twilight of the lab to the harsh, bright reality of packing was jarring. We had to separate. We had to become Dr. Thorne and her assistant again. We moved through the station, sealing boxes, powering down servers, zipping up duffel bags. But the energy had shifted. The frantic avoidance of the last few weeks was gone, replaced by a magnetic tether. Every time we passed each other in the narrow corridor, her hand would brush the small of my back, a grounded, possessive touch that said, I'm here. When I struggled with the heavy crate of samples, she was there instantly, her shoulder pressing against mine as we lifted it together. It wasn't just professional cooperation anymore. It was a partnership. I found myself pausing in the galley, looking at the empty coffee mugs in the sink, suddenly terrified. What happens when we land? I asked, my voice small over the noise of the approaching chopper. What happens when you have to go to a board meeting and I have to go to the grad student lab? Julianne stopped sealing a Pelican case. She walked over to me, ignoring the roar outside, and framed my face with her hands. Her thumbs swept over my cheekbones, wiping away the fear. Then I will text you under the table at the board meeting, she said, her voice steady and sure. And you will meet me for coffee afterwards. And we will figure it out. This isn't station fever, Emma. The ice didn't make me want you. You made me want you. She kissed me one last time in the safety of the station. A hard, promising press of lips that sealed the deal better than any contract. Then she pulled away, grabbed her parka, and tossed mine to me. Gear up, she ordered, the command back in her voice, but her eyes were smiling. Let's go home. Walking out to the helicopter felt like walking onto a stage. The wind wash from the rotors was brutal, kicking up a blinding cloud of snow. The pilot was waving us forward. I watched Julianne march ahead, her head down against the wind, carrying the hard drives that contained our scientific legacy. But I knew the real discovery wasn't on those drives. It was walking right in front of me. We had survived the storm, the isolation, and the cold. But more importantly, we had survived the silence between us. As I climbed into the chopper, leaving the metal shell of Station 4 behind, I realized I wasn't leaving anything that mattered. I was bringing it with me. The expedition was over, but the story, our story, was just beginning. The heavy steel door clicked shut for the final time, sealing the silence of the station behind us. We walked out into the blinding white storm of the rotor wash, the wind screaming against our parkas. I watched Julianne march ahead, then reach back blindly. I grabbed her hand, her gloved fingers squeezing mine hard, a secret, solid anchor in the chaos. The walls were gone. If you want to hear how we navigate the return to civilization, subscribe and let me know in the comments.